that there are too many requests now for customer satisfaction surveys. This is partly because of the internet and things like SurveyMonkey, so a lot of people are doing it themselves. I don't know if you can see at the back, but this is a request that I got after I'd been to the dental hygienist. A perfectly routine and uneventful and dull encounter. I had nothing to say about it. I didn't particularly want to take part in the survey, but yet I got this request. And most weeks I get several requests to take part in the survey, normally online. There are some websites that automatically ask you to do a pop-up, and there are some helplines. Nokia is one, BT is another, where there's automatically, if you phone up, you're asked if you want to take part in the survey. And it's just irritating, frankly. And the other problem I have, or one of the other problems I have, is that us market researchers use language in a very funny way. This is a picture of two blokes in a pub. I could replace it with any other social interaction. Two women talking, people, colleagues in an office chatting, a generational mix, different ethnic groups. It doesn't matter what it is. But you would never in real life find people using language like this. We just don't say to our friends and relatives on a scale of 1 to 10, what was the restaurant like, or would you say you were very or quite satisfied with the hotel? We just don't do it. And if we did do it, people would think that we were a bit odd. And I think that if you want to engage people in a dialogue about your brand, your product, your service, you need to try and use their language as much as possible and try and make it as natural as possible. So I start with that assumption. Another issue which really irritates me is the fact that organisations ask questions that I don't want to answer. I have an opinion about recommendation and the net promoter and all of that, but that's not my point here. This is a survey that I was asked to take part in shortly after I'd had a not very satisfactory experience with Vodafone. And it began with the recommend question. Well, what I wanted to do was tell them about my unfortunate experience, which is not going to be possible on a mobile phone survey. So it was a demonstration to me of a complete lack of customer focus. And this, I'm using Vodafone as an example, but everybody does it. We get asked to take part in surveys which do not relate to the experience we've had. It's a one-size-fits-all experience. I flew to Edinburgh from Gatwick in October. I knew the airline well. It was a short flight. All I wanted was to take off on time and land on time. About 10 days later, I got an invitation from the airline to take part in the survey. It had something like 30 or 40 rating scales, mainly about things I wasn't interested in. There was no in-flight entertainment. There was no in-flight catering, and so on. I think there was something like 10 questions on the check-in experience. And the thing that they didn't ask me about was the fact that on the way up to Edinburgh, my bag didn't travel with me. And although the bag actually did land in Edinburgh at 9 o'clock in the evening, it was a late afternoon flight, I didn't get the bag until mid-morning the following day, after I had to go to a meeting without the benefit of clean clothes. And this survey was totally disconnected from information that the airline had about my customer experience. But these bits of the organisation went joined up. So I was asked to go through a very irrelevant interview questionnaire, which detracted from my customer experience. It lowered my satisfaction. So there's an issue of relevance and frequency and language. And I've been as guilty of this as anybody. Questionnaires are often repetitive and very boring, particularly the use of rating scales. There is nothing more boring on the telephone than being asked to do a telephone interview where you're asked to give ratings on a scale of 1 to 10 or from very satisfied to quite dissatisfied. It's pretty boring doing it online. It's not too bad if it's on paper and pencil because you can sort of flick through it quite quickly. But it really is an extremely boring, particularly if most of the questions aren't relevant, if they weren't in the airline experience, and particularly if, as some people do, particularly on online surveys, they force you to give an answer, at which point I stop. You know, if it's not relevant and there's no doesn't apply or don't know box, well then I stop. And in the past, some of the ICG surveys have been guilty of that. But what we get in customer satisfaction and customer experience measurement is too many questions which are long and boring, and we get questionnaires which are not tailored to experience. And it's not just that the interview or the questionnaire is dull and repetitive. We get really boring charts. And this is a real example. I've disguised this a little. This is for a computer company. And the survey, the customer experience survey, had a lot of stakeholders. There were people who did the hardware, there were people who did the software, people who wrote the manuals. So everybody had a bit of the questionnaire, and they all wanted a bit of report. So we had to produce this massive slide deck, and although there was a management summary, which wrapped things up quite neatly and made some recommendations, they wanted to sit through the presentation, and I was forced to prepare something like this and deliver something like this. And the problem is that on most of these things, you don't get much measurement year in, year out. Partly because, on the whole, things are normally quite good, and there's always a bit of random fluctuation. And partly because the really difficult things that really do need fixing usually take some time to address. So the end result is stuff that's really not very interesting and not terribly useful. Also, if you've put people through a fairly long interview with a lot of repetitive questions, they're disinclined to answer the questions about, well, what should we do about it? And why is it so bad? And what were the good things and so on? They don't give you the diagnostic information, so then you have to go and do another survey. Now, I'd like to suggest to you that there's another way of doing this. There's another way of measuring and looking at customer satisfaction and the customer experience. I'd like to persuade you that you only need 3 questions. And I think with 3 questions you can cover more or less any market, B2B or consumer. You can do it on any medium that you like. And you don't need to use any fancy algorithms, any black box kind of techniques, and it's not a proprietary technique, anybody can do it. And there's a quote at the bottom which you may not be able to read, but it's from a respondent who was pleased with the survey, and he made the important point that it wasn't too long and you could highlight in more detail specific issues, which is what you want out of any kind of feedback. You don't want it to be too long, and you want people to give you the detail where necessary. So, 3 questions. The first 2 are dead easy. It's a question about the positives, and it's a question about the negatives, to be worded in whatever way is appropriate to the market or segment that you're interested in. Very often, in customer satisfaction or customer experience surveys, it's all about the negatives. And I think this is a mistake for 3 reasons. First of all, it's rather a negative experience for the customer. It's also a negative experience if you're on the receiving end and you're sitting watching somebody give a presentation which is all about the bad news and they never tell you anything positive. And you also miss important diagnostic information. So I think positives, it's very important to do this. So I'll ask 2 questions. You can do this in a very structured way. So if it's a telephone interview, or if it's a self-completion exercise online or on paper, then there will be a list of options, reasons why you're happy with the car or not happy with the car, gearbox, clutch, etc. Radio. So you can tick the boxes. You can also do it as a more qualitative exercise, where you ask people what they like, and you only prompt them by in a very general and indirect way. Well, what happened next? And is there anything else? And is that the reason why you were pleased? And so on. But without prompting, what about the engine, what about the gearbox? And if you do it that way, you can get a lot of very good qualitative information. And all that material can be coded either during the interview or afterwards for the quantitative analysis. So questions 1 and 2, I think, give you quite a lot of information. And question 3 is an overall satisfaction question. And I've put 3 wordings up here. I think you only need one overall satisfaction question. On the right is a set of questions that were involved, that were in a survey that I did for some years for a well-known market research agency. And they actually had 6 questions like this, which were all to do with overall satisfaction. And as an analyst, as an interviewer, I can tell you they're all highly correlated. There's not much difference, frankly. Well, there is possibly a difference with this question here, which I think is a real, I'd ban it if I ruled the world, because sometimes people will say, my expectations were low, and the service was crap, so I'm going to give it a 10, because it matched my expectations perfectly. And if you find yourself as an interviewer asking this question, I used to have to do it in depth interviews as part of relationship auditing, you would just get, a sigh or a look and not answered. But I think you only need one question. If you have to have the recommend question because your client insists on it and is a believer in the Net Promoter Church, well, then ask that question and don't bother with overall satisfaction, because you're going to get the same number anyway, more or less. So, now the question then is, you've got 3 questions. What are you going to do with the data? And are you going to get all the diagnostics and stuff that you need? Well, what you have for each strength or weakness, let's take the car example. And by the way, this technique was originally developed in the automotive industry. I didn't invent it. I merely nicked it and modified it. For each positive about your car, you know how many people say it's positive, think there's something they like about their car. And you also know, for that group of people, what their satisfaction level is, whether it's on an average score on a 1 to 10 scale, or whether it's percent very satisfied. So you've got 2 bits of information about each strength or each weakness. And this is an example. This is a mobile phone project. These are people who called up about a problem with their phone. And the service attribute was an immediate recognition of the cause or issue, not wasting time trying to explain to the person what happened. 33% of the people of the sample cited this attribute as a positive. 67% didn't. Of those who cited it as a positive, 52% were very satisfied. Of those that didn't cite it, 23% were very satisfied. So you've got a difference here of 29%. So what you've got for this attribute is you've got 2 important numbers. 33% of people think it's a positive, 29% is the difference that makes. Now, if you want to do trend charts, you can take, this is a negative here, you can take the percent who mentioned something and you can trend it. And that's just, so you can have the same kind of charts as you normally have in a customer experience survey. You're just using slightly different data, that's all. But you can also use these 2 measures to do some more interesting analysis. Here we've got a 2-dimensional chart. Now typically in customer satisfaction surveys you tend to have overall satisfaction and you have, in the other dimension, you have the derived importance. the relationship, the satisfaction level has on overall satisfaction. On this axis here, I presented the percentage difference if shown as a positive. This is the 29% number I just showed you. And this is the reach. That's customer impact. This is reach. This is the percent of people who mentioned something. And I put some dots on the chart, and I'm going to show you now a couple of case histories. The first one is a company that Mark Lyons will be very familiar with. This is a global vendor of messaging products and services.